Now look, hear me out. I understand the reputation for most Brits around the world. I understand that when you hear a British voice, a lot of the time you're thinking, oh, here comes the sarcasm. A lot of that dry arch stuff. Basically, a lot of negativity. But the reality is the majority of us Brits are actually broadly quite positive, quite affable. And most of the time, we're trying to toe every single day along the line, trying to find the line between Hugh Grant and Alan Rickman. We're not that negative. Now, I say all of that because, understand, it pains me. It actually brings me no pleasure in saying that this is one of the worst NAS devices I've ever reviewed here on the channel. And alongside that, I am baffled that this, the AceMagic N3A, exists in 2026. In today's review, I'm going to talk about this device. I'm going to go through the positives and, frankly, a bucket load of negatives. So strap in and let's start the review. But a little bit of context. This device arrives at $339 currently on AceMagic's own website. I'm sure it's going to go on Amazon and stuff later on. For $339, you are getting an AMD-powered NAS. I'll get onto the chip in a moment. With 4 hard drive bays, it has 2 M.2 NVMe bays, and it's got 2.5 gig networking. It's a metal chassis around there with 2-tone cooling, 1 CPU cooler over the processor, and a main fan there on the rear. The CPU is the R2544. That is 4 cores, 8 threads that can support ECC. So already out the gate at $339, that is bloody impressive. $339, when you look at the market for a 4-bay, you are looking pretty strictly at only ARM-powered NAS devices there, very low-powered NAS devices indeed. And ultimately, for the proposition and the design and the feature set, $339 is a bargain. However, a $339 does not include RAM. It does not include your OS SSD. This doesn't have eMMC inside it. It's nothing like that. So in 2026, these two pricey little numbers need to be added to that price point, because a lot of the ARM-powered NAS devices that we talked about previously, they arrive with LPDDR memory already pre-installed, and generally a small area of eMMC with the OS running because of those ARM processors. They generally always have that. So this already has that slight shortfall against some of the ARM-based NASs that I talked about. And that's before we even get to your hard drive storage media. But let's talk about the design of this. Now, long-time followers of the channel may be quite aware of what this device actually is. And if you don't, and you still follow the channel for a while, how about now? This is a NAS that was originally made by Aoostar. This chassis, not so much this architecture, but our first encounter with this was in September 2024 with the WTR Pro. That was a 4-bay NAS that was available with an N100 series processor from Intel or an AMD Ryzen 7 embedded processor. So we've already seen this, but this is arriving with a different AMD processor. Indeed, that CPU, and we'll get onto it later on, is actually a lot more comparable to what we've seen from the Synology 925 series there. It's a really, quite impressive CPU when used right. Foreshadowing. And as we mentioned in our original Aoostar review of this chassis, at first I was really perplexed by the complete lack of ports on the rear and thought it was kind of weird that all of the connections were based on the side. But over time, I kind of really came round to the idea that volumetrically it makes a lot more sense to have all of the ports facing this way, because then the system can be aligned against the wall and the airflow can work horizontally rather than the back of the system potentially being by a wall and therefore restricting airflow. This actually makes a lot more sense as air passes through both the fan and the vent chamber at the bottom. But the ports and connections themselves, which we'll get onto later on, may not blow everyone away. But returning to the storage, we've got this removable front panel here. It's magnetized on all the sides, and you've got the 4 trays inside there. Drives are technically click and load because there are screw holes, but there's the little widgets there on either side. So once you slide the drive in place, the drive is inside. There you go. Again, goes inside nice and easy, pretty much like most other NAS devices, and you're good to go. There's no locking mechanism, but there are LEDs there on the front, and the drives go in nice and easy, but you will need screws for 2.5-inch media, which weren't included. Now, I'm anti-waste. I know a lot of the time when people get NAS devices, they arrive with Ethernet cables that they might not need. They have screws that you might not need. I get it, but the retail kit for this was still, nevertheless, quite lackluster for people that might buy this, and it will be the only NAS solution they buy for a number of years. They might need an RJ45 cable. They might need the screws to the individual drives. There is an argument for waste, but I will also add that they included an HDMI cable, and I would argue there's a higher possibility of people having HDMI cables knocking around than they are for RJ45 cables knocking around in their homes. I know I'm being pernickety, but all of these were like the death of 1,000 cuts for a NAS that just seems to have elements of compromise whichever way I looked. There is an external PSU included with the kit. This is a 120 watt cloverleaf power brick that runs from the rear of the system. That's not bad. There's plenty of 4-bay NAS solutions that arrive with external power supplies. But I tell you what, a lot of 4-bay desktop NAS devices don't feature: the odd PCIe controller arrangement inside this system. Let me explain. We've got 4 SATA drives in here. Whether it is you're going to be utilising 3.5-inch SATA hard drives or 2.5-inch SATA SSDs, there is a good potential there for 4 hard drives there to crack around 500 to 600 megabytes comfortably in the right RAID array. Or with SATA SSDs, you could get 700 or 800 megabytes, which is why I was perplexed when digging into the SSH on this, utilising Zima OS. I found inside an ASM 1061 controller /1062. That controller, notwithstanding I found reports online that apparently it sometimes doesn't play nice with Unraid, I also found it was on a Gen 1 × 1 downgraded lane. That's like 250 megabytes per second. But it doesn't end there, because on the base of the system, when you remove the base panel here on the bottom, you find the 2 M.2 NVMe slots there at the bottom alongside the SODIMM slots for the memory. We'll come back around to the memory later on. Now, in the original WTR Pro that we reviewed again, September 2024, that was running on an AMD chip, and that had 3 M.2 NVMe slots inside. This has 2. Try as I might with multiple M.2 NVMe's I tried, I never saw a higher speed than Gen 1 × 4. Gen 1 × 4, realistically capping out at around 900 to 950 megabytes per second conventionally each. And that played out when I did repeat read-write testing on the SSD. I never saw performance higher than 900 to about 950 up and down. So, a quick update to this video. I'm just sort of slamming this here in the middle because, frankly, I don't think it changes my overall opinion of the N3A. I managed to really spend some time dicking around with BIOS there and opening up some of the PCIe. By default, when the device arrived, that was why a lot of the lanes were downgraded all by default. And if you make your way into the BIOS settings there, you can actually open up a lot of the PCIe configuration to allow for greater performance, ultimately allowing each one of those components to go to their fullest bandwidth potential there. Opening up, for example, the M.2 NVMe's to Gen 3 × 4, opening up the SATA controller to Gen 2 × 1, and even the network adapters there being upgraded to Gen 2. So, on the face of it, that does sound pretty good. Well, a few things. Number one, the reason I pretty much still stand by most of the stuff I've said in this video, and that's going to come later in the video, is because this is still an off-the-shelf NAS solution. If I was going to dick around with BIOS, I wouldn't buy pre-built. I would buy all of the motherboard, the components and the bits and the bobs in between, and I would have built it from scratch and then played with the BIOS effectively. I don't expect to have to play around with the BIOS when I'm dealing with a solution. You can tell this is being recorded ad hoc, right? I don't expect to buy an off-the-shelf solution and have to knock around with the BIOS there. That shouldn't be the onus on me. Buying pre-built means it should be tweaked to the very least to a balanced perspective between power utilization and performance there. And then if I want to tweak things up and down, then I should go into BIOS. But the idea that this system arrived in this state is not good, and a lot of users wouldn't have played around with those settings long term. And even then, if you open up the SATA to Gen 2 times 1, that's still only affording me around 500 megabytes per second throughput there. And yes, there's already the massive throttle of the network connections on this system as is. But 500 megabytes per second, give or take, and by that I actually mean between 450 and 550 realistically. You know, 4 SSDs in there, you're going to get throttled. Even 4 hard drives in there, modern hard drives these days, are still going to get somewhat throttled with throughput inside the system, even if you're going to discount the external bandwidth. And as for the M.2 NVMe's on Gen 3 times 4, that should have allowed, at the very least, 2.5 gigabytes per second there. Realistically, on their own, in a standalone PC dedicated synthetic throughput, they would exceed 3 gigabytes. But I would have expected in excess of 2 to 2.5 gigabytes per second, and in my testing, in terms of read performance, I only saw around 1.5 to maximum 1.7 gigabytes per second internal performance over SSH, and in terms of write, I saw just over 500 megabytes per second. The point I'm making is, even with me opening up a lot of the potential of this device in BIOS, it still left me disappointed. Hence why I still stand by everything I've said thus far, and the idea that I've still got to knock around and pull apart this system in the BIOS is not acceptable in an off-the-shelf solution. But let's go back to the video. And it doesn't end there, because the ports and connections on this, you know, there is some good here. We've got 10 gig USB, we've got HDMI and DisplayPort, we've even got an SD card TF slot here, and a USB Type-C input as well, just for external storage. You can't use it for direct connectivity. But the 2 network connections, only one of them's 2.5 gig. The other one is 1 gig. So, I mean, even if we didn't have that SATA controller downgrade or the M.2 downgrade there, saturation would still not be possible, because they've only got one 2.5 gig and a single 1 gig on this system. And they are on a Gen 1 speed lane as well. They're listed at Gen 1 times 1, which means, again, you can't even achieve saturation point on that. Now, I went into BIOS, and yes, you could tweak some things, you could play around, but this is a pre-built NAS solution. People don't buy these solutions to tweak that much. And even if you could play around and open some things up, this in its default off-the-shelf state, in terms of that lane distribution, was unacceptable. One of the things that really intrigued me about this NAS when I first heard about it a few months ago was that processor, the R2544. It was a CPU that about a year ago I thought Synology might be utilising in their Plus series devices. It is a 4-core 8-thread processor that has integrated Vega 8 Radeon graphics included there. So you've got your integrated graphics at 1.25, I think 1.3 gigahertz there. That quad-core processor actually has a decent little clock speed as well, at base 3.35 that can be burst up to 3.7 when needed. Again, this chip supports ECC RAM as well. I thought this was going to be a processor that Synology would start using. However, they didn't. These guys did. And to my knowledge, they're not utilising it anywhere near as they could with 16 lanes of Gen 3 architecture to play with. And do you remember I alluded to ECC there? This thing wouldn't see it. I tried 2 different sticks of confirmed ECC memory inside this, went into SSH terminal, via terminal, and nope. It could see the individual bit there. You can see the difference there in allocation, but no ECC was available to me there. And again, that is baffling to me that a system like this would not allow me to do that when the chip has got the architecture ready to rock. That isn't to say that that is a bad CPU. There's a reason I thought brands were going to utilise this chip more, and why I was really interested in this. It has a decent little base clock speed there to really get a lot of stuff done, and thanks to those 8 threads, those vCPUs could be doing quite a lot in your virtualization or container. Yes, the TDP is a little higher, I think 35 to 54 watt, and we'll go through power consumption and noise and stuff in a moment, but it's the idea that that processor isn't being utilised to the extent that a system like this should be capable of providing. I mean, again, when I was using Plex running on this containerised in Zima, it was running fine. I had two 4K, high-dense 4K transcodes happening in real time alongside a native 4K playback. The CPU didn't care. I even added a couple of more transcodes on top of that. It was running absolutely fine. That CPU, when used right, can really do a job. But it's the idea that in its base configuration here, I was having such a rum time of it. What do you mean software section? This thing doesn't include software. Why on earth have I included this in the video? At this point, I was all set to just give up on the review, but no, I persevered because, let's face it, someone might buy this device and it's only fair they get a fair swing at just what this device does. So at this point, I went with the power consumption test, and I went ahead, removed the storage media apart from the two M.2 NVMe's inside with 4 gig of RAM, and then went ahead and just wanted to see what the base power consumption was, and that sat around 10 to 12 watts. Absolutely respectable, actually not too shabby for a processor that I thought would have a higher base TDP on its own. Now, when I went ahead and installed 4 hard drives inside alongside those two M.2s, the same RAM, and just left the system idle, after 10 minutes, it was showing me around 38 to 39 watts power utilization. Again, once you factor in 5 to 6 watts for each of those bigger hard drives there, that actually works out pretty darn good. Finally, I went with full CPU utilization. That's close to 98, 100% CPU utilization with all 4 hard drives being accessed, both SSDs being accessed, and the fan starting to ramp up ever so slightly. And at that point, I saw the system, again, with larger hard drives being factored in here, so each of those hard drives would have leapt up to about 7 to 9 watts power draw. It was sat at around 71 to 72 watts. So again, not too bad. Once you factored in the 4 hard drives and a high level of access going on at that point, that's actually not too bad, because it's not going to be 70 odd all the time. And had you used SATA SSDs or smaller drives, you could have comfortably sliced off 20 to 25 watts or even more with those SATA SSDs. What about noise? I removed active drive utilization out of the equation, because even though this is a metal NAS, I thought it was kind of unfair based on the scale of the drives I was using, because bigger 24 and 30 TB drives, they make a hell of a racket. So I just settled on what I wanted to know was the system in idle, and I wanted to see what the phone noise would be like at its highest point. Now, I wasn't able, via different software that I tried, to activate the fans or have any manner of control. That's not unusual. A lot of the DIY NASs don't actually allow for native fan control unless the software and the hardware is generally built together, or at least a command line is entered here or there. But in BIOS, I was able to dick around with that. So in idle, that's with the system, with the fan set to auto and the drives just sitting there waiting to be used. It's sat at around 34 to 35 dBA. It peaked a couple of times, but it is a noisy office environment with the road just outside. Not a huge surprise. Now, when I went into BIOS and ramped up the fans as high as I could, from that point, it went up to about 47 to 48 dBA. Again, pretty respectable numbers, I would say. I expected it to crank into the 55, maybe even a little higher. I've seen systems of a similar scale and, metal enclosure be louder than that. So fair play to them. With the ventilation at the back, the cooling at the bottom and the ports on the side, it's a pretty good number. Let's listen to those now. Ultimately, my problem with this NAS is it's really hard to understand who the target demo is. It is a nice chassis. I said as much at the time when I first saw it 2 years ago. But there's bizarre choices in the architecture, bizarre choices with the ports and connectivity, and arguably bizarre choices in the system as a whole in 2026, when NAS brands right now are being very competitive about what they are offering you for their money, when they know that certain components in 2026 are making up the lion's share of the user's budget. This is AceMagic's first NAS, and there is a vibe from this that they have been sat on this in development for quite a long time, and now it's just get it out there feelings about it. At 339, if you're prepared to put in the time to make the tweaks, there is some stuff to like here. And once you compare it against what 339 buys you in the market right now in turnkey ready-to-go NAS solutions, it's actually quite a compelling hardware proposition. But you need to put the time in to tweak it. And frankly, once you start tallying up how much your time costs and just what is included in terms of OS, in terms of RAM, with a lot of those ARM NAS models I talked about in the beginning, it makes the value proposition a little weaker. I don't like making a video ragging on a solution, but I just can't recommend this. And once you factor that in with the rep right now that AceMagic is still trying to shake off, after all that software stuff that came with their mini PCs a while ago, and if you know, you know, I was trying my best not to impact this video with that because it's not fair. This is software led, and by the way, I did have this running behind a network controller from UniFi. I didn't see any dodgy packets to be worried about, but still, I just can't recommend this because there are just better options in the market right now, and people's money is tight. But what do you guys think? Let's talk about it more in the comments. You know, AceMagic have supplied this unit. They're not paying for this review, but they've supplied the hardware, and I'm fairly certain they're not going to be happy with this review, but what are you going to do? I've put a link below that you can get a hold of this for yourself. Do let me know if you do, because it'll be fun to see that. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.